So Lauryn is a women's human rights activist focused on education in conflict zones. At age 14, Lauryn read about the Taliban and their treatment of women and girls, and she wrote up a petition demanding that the world respond to the misogynistic policies, and has continued this work ever since. So Lauryn's talk is called Human Capital as the Best Peacebuilding Strategy. So please give her a nice warm welcome for Lauryn coming up for the talk. Thank you, Lauryn.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a frigid, dark November evening to listen to these talks. As you heard, we'll slightly switch direction here, but I think the theme is kind of connected. This is about sustainability in a way, too, and sustainability of the planet, of the human planet. So this photo is a pretty well-known image taken during the time of the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, in Kabul specifically, the capital, which lasted from 1996 to 2001. And during that time, the Taliban put in place a number of edicts over the whole population of Afghanistan. Things like there were no pictures of living things allowed. There were no non-religious books allowed. The books were actually gathered and burned. Toys were made illegal. Music was made illegal. So a long list of edicts that affected everyone, but then there was another long list of edicts that were reserved especially for women and girls. And one of those was that girls couldn't go to school anymore at any level, from primary to university. Women weren't allowed to work outside the home. They weren't even allowed to leave their homes unless they were accompanied by an immediate male relative, which posed a problem for the tens of thousands of war widows who lived in the country and had no one to go shopping for them or take them out of the house. The windows of homes where women lived had to be painted black so that they couldn't be seen from the streets outside, because of the idea that the very image of women was corrupting to the souls of men. Women weren't allowed to be treated in the healthcare system because they could only be treated by other women, but of course all the women workers were sent home, so there were no longer women workers, women doctors and nurses. And then a whole bunch of small, seemingly insignificant edicts, like women couldn't wear shoes that made noise, they couldn't wear white socks, they couldn't wear nail polish, couldn't wear makeup. So in 1996, on the other side of the world, here in the Lower Mainland, I was a 9th grader, and I read about this in the newspaper, in the Vancouver Sun. And I couldn't find Afghanistan on a map for the life of me. I didn't know anything at all about the country or that part of the world. But I think, as we learned from the previous presentation, young people are good at seeing a wrong when they see it, and knowing that it's wrong. And we haven't been infected yet by the kinds of excuses for inaction that will rise up later. So I knew this was wrong, and I was enraged, actually. That was the dominant emotion, for sure. I was really angry, and I just kept thinking, if someone told me, you can't go to school because you're a girl, I wouldn't accept this for myself. So why would I accept it for anyone else, anywhere else in the world? So I felt I had to do something. But what was the question? I was 14 years old. I didn't know anything about anything. And I wrote a petition. I haven't read it in a long time, but I'm sure it was quite crudely worded with my demands. And then I gathered a few hundred signatures, and I sent it off to the government. I sent a copy to the Americans just for good measure. And I sent a copy to the Taliban. I found their fax number on a website. So I sent them the petition. They didn't answer. And after I sent this off, I kind of wondered, what should I do now? And that's how I discovered this organization, Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan. They had started in Calgary in 1996, and it was then, as it is now, a grassroots movement of Canadians from all walks of life, women and men, actually, who felt the same as me, that this was unacceptable and we have to do something. So I called them up and I said, I'm in Vancouver, what can I do? I decided not to mention that I was a teenager, and they said, well, you could start the Vancouver chapter. And I said, okay, sure. So off I went, and 23 years later, here I am, still doing the same thing, but in a slightly different format. So we got to work right away, raising awareness, trying to get other people to learn about what was happening and do something, and also raising money, which at that time we were raising money for clandestine girls' schools in Afghanistan, secret schools underground. And finding out about this human rights catastrophe was my original motivation, and it still is really my driving force, but it was the original reason that landed me in Afghanistan. And I arrived there for the first time in the winter of 2003. And the Taliban regime had fallen by then. The country was reopening to the world again. And at that time, I was halfway through a bachelor's degree in international development, and I also worked for a federal government agency that was funding women's rights programming in Afghanistan. And so I really had this human rights agenda in the front of my mind when I got there. But when I talked to women and girls there, they said, yeah, we know about human rights. We know what it is to be denied human rights. And we want those rights. We deserve them. We know that inherently. But we can't do anything about the denial of our rights as long as most of us can't read and write. Which seems so obvious, but it was like, oh, yeah, duh. And I realized that I had put the cart before the horse a little bit. And I saw clearly on that first trip and subsequent trips that the path to rights and to empowerment lies through education. So our organization around this time gradually started moving towards working solely in the education sector. Originally, we had done some work in healthcare and economic development and other sectors, but we decided to focus our resources and efforts and build our expertise just in the education sector, and we've been doing that ever since. And for myself personally, I decided to go back to school because I realized I needed an education about education. So I earned a doctorate in language and literacy education so that I would have a technical skill area to bring to this work. And I'll tell you a little bit about our programs and the work we do. We have 3 well-established programs that have been running for many, many years, sometimes a decade or longer in some areas. And you can read more about them on our website. We have a lot of projects in each of these programs, but I'll just give you a few highlights right now. So we deliver basic literacy. We take people who are completely illiterate and get them to literacy fluency within 12 months. And we have about 1,000 women a year who graduate from our literacy program, which is called Afghanistan Reads. Each class of 20 students has a library in the classroom. And we do that because we think literacy can't be sustained without access to books. You can't just teach the skill of literacy. People also need to read things that are interesting and relevant to them and appropriate for their reading level. And so we try to foster this love of reading as part of our literacy work. We have a girls' school in Kabul that goes from grade 1 to grade 11. We've trained 10,000 teachers in 7 different provinces. We have a digital library of educational materials in 7 languages, and we have just over 4,000 resources in that library right now, and that's accessed on average more than 100,000 times a month by people in Afghanistan, and we have users in every one of the 34 provinces. My colleague who's actually here, who's the manager of that library and goes back and forth between Afghanistan and Canada, calls it the little Wikipedia, or the Wikipedia of Afghanistan. It's like a very small Wikipedia. And then we have an offline version of that library that we've installed in teachers' colleges around the country so that people can use it without internet. We've sent over 50 girls to university on scholarships, and we've equipped just shy of 300 schools with their first library and their first science lab. We've published hundreds of children's storybooks in Afghan languages and distributed tens of thousands of these books across the country. And again, my colleague who's here, Parwani, do you want to just wave so people know who you are? And if you want to talk to him after, he's in charge of recruiting the translators and volunteers for this campaign. So if any of you happen to speak Pashto or Uzbeki or Nuristani or Swazi or any of those languages, we'll be trying to sign you up later. We funded Braille books for the library at the Blind School of Kabul, and we're planning more work to support them, and we're really excited about that. And we developed a national computer science curriculum for Afghanistan, and we've also developed curriculum in literacy education and life skills and a range of other topics. So what I learned in planning and running these programs is that literacy and education do lead to rights, and rights in turn lead to empowerment. And over again, in mud-walled classrooms, in concrete basic education classrooms, I've seen that spark go off inside an individual where they go from illiterate to literate. And when you master the skill of reading, especially as an adult, which is a really hard thing to do, once you're over the age of 30, learning your own language in writing, the script of your own language, is the equivalent of anyone in this room trying to learn Cyrillic, because it's really hard to get the fluency rate. You have to be able to read at a speed of at least 40 words per minute, and that's the reading brain of an adult is different than the reading brain of a child. That's why you want to get your kids to learn to read other languages very, very young, because it gets much, much harder as an adult. So if you can imagine, a woman who has perhaps lost her husband, she's raised 8 to 10 kids in poverty, she's survived war, maybe she's been a refugee or an internally displaced person, she's struggled all her life, and she has decided, I am going to learn to read and write. And she shows up for day one of her classroom knowing there's a year ahead of her, and she doesn't know a single letter. She can't write her own name. And she sits down and she opens her book and she puts her letter on the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, A, and starts. She's a brave, courageous person that's committed to something and has taken on something that's very, very hard. And when she gets to the end, when she graduates from that class and she's literate and she's fluently literate, she has the sense that she can do anything, that she can take on the world. And we have seen girls, or young women, and older women, who've come into the class not knowing one letter and graduated and gone on to grade school and gone into university. And one woman told me, oh, you have a PhD? Maybe I'll do that. I think I'll do that next. And she hadn't quite finished the literacy class yet, year one of the literacy class, but she was seized by this sense of empowerment, a sense of agency. So that's what agency is, the sense that you can do anything. You've probably heard of Amartya Sen, the Nobel-winning economist, who was the first person to sort of change the way we saw development. Traditionally, development was understood as economic measures, as GDP, per capita income, as being the wealth of a society. But Sen proposed that development is actually really about what the individuals in a society feel like they can do, what they're capable of doing, the power that they have over change in their own lives and in making change in the society around them. So this was really revolutionary when this idea came out, that societies only develop when the individuals in those societies have a sense of agency. And one only gains agency when they have opportunities to learn. Not just formal education, I mean learning writ large. Obviously, learning happens outside of formal educational institutions, but you often need school to kick it off. Most people learn how to read and write for the first time in a school. And so there's this relationship between agency and development, and there's also a relationship between development and peace. They're very, very closely intertwined. And you may have noticed that the places that are most vulnerable to state failure, to violent conflict, are also often the poorest places in the world. And not coincidentally, they're the places that have the lowest educational rates in the world. Places like Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, Congo. And another common characteristic of these same states is that there's often very, very high rates of gender inequality, acute gender inequality. There's a researcher, Dr. Valerie Hudson, who's the head researcher and founder of the largest extant database of state characteristics in the world. And I want to read you a quote from her based on the findings of their research. So what they did was they ran all these correlations, trying to find out what causes states to be unstable, what causes war. And they're correlations, so they're not necessarily causal, but they're suggestive of being causal. So Hudson said, there is a strong and highly significant link between state security and women's security. In fact, the very best predictor of a state's peacefulness is not its level of wealth, its level of democracy, or its ethno-religious identity. The best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well its women are treated. So places that are poor, dangerous, and unequal, they get bypassed by trade and investment. And they get stuck in cycles of poverty, which fuels more violence and more instability. And that just leads to constant conflict. And when human beings are not secure, their society can't develop economically, socially, or politically. So they end up cut off from the world, ostracized, isolated, and or totally dependent on aid. And the only way to break this cycle is for the society to develop human capital, its own human capital. And you get human capital when people have opportunities to learn. So the Sustainable Development Goals, out of all of these, one of them is necessary to reach all of them. And that's number 4, quality education. For number 3, good health and well-being, you need doctors and nurses and researchers. For number 6, clean water and sanitation, you need engineers and environmentalists and water conservation experts, and probably some youth activists as well, climate change activists. For number 5, gender equality, you need girls who go to school alongside boys. You need female teachers alongside male teachers. So the only viable and sustainable way for a society to achieve these things is to do it through their own human capital. And no amount of aid money, loans, outside experts, NGOs, aid agencies can do all of these things for another country indefinitely. So in closing, I ask you to try to look at the world in this light, to know that every useful thing, all progress, all invention, all innovation, all courage, all acts of courage, all acts of agency, every good idea came from a person who had agency. And to get that agency, they had to have had an opportunity to learn. So it took me many years and lots of voyages to war zones to see this clearly, but now that I see it, I know that we have the most powerful solution already in existence, staring us in the face to so many of the world's ills, to war, to poverty, to underdevelopment. We have a way already to stop inequity, to build wealth, and that's education. So we need schools, we need teachers, we need books, we need kids in classrooms, we need women who are able to learn to read and write at any age. So I ask you to please promote this idea that the world is powered by human capital and that everyone has a right to it. And if we allow that to happen, she will save us. So let's make sure she has the chance to. Thank you.